I'd like to introduce the moderator of our next panel, which is What Have We Learned Since Venona? Our moderator is Timothy Naftali. He's a clinical associate professor of history and public service at NYU and currently a CNN presidential historian. He was also the director of Tamiment and co-director of the Center for the United States of the Cold War in 2014-2015. Tim writes on national security and intelligence policy, international history, and presidential history. He's the author of books such as One Hell of a Gamble, Khrushchev, Castro, and Kennedy, 1958 to 1964, and Khrushchev's Cold War, the latter winning the Duke of Westminster's Medal for Military Literature in 2007. He's currently working on a book on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. Naftali came to NYU after serving as the founding director of the Federal Richard Nixon Presidential Library and Museum in Yorba Linda, California, where he authored the library's Watergate exhibit, which came out in 2011 and is still there, and oversaw the release of 1.3 million pages of presidential documents and nearly 700 hours of Nixon tapes. So please welcome Tim Naftali.
First of all, welcome, and I want to thank Michael Konsowitz for having organized a great conference. I'm really delighted to be here and on this panel. You are about to be treated to the views, thoughts, musings, and recent research of three very, very good historians. Historians of biography, historians of the Cold War, historians of intelligence. This is a treat. And I want to make sure we have time for a Q&A so you can benefit from that by asking them questions. They have important biographies. I'm going to mention something about each one. Beverly Gage is one of the reasons why we have smarter, better political history now. There was a period in the 90s, I would argue, late 80s and 90s, when political history was not as popular in academia, when bright young people, for one reason or another, with a few exceptions, didn't go into the business. And that began to change. And it began to change because of people like Bev Gage, who did superb work that managed to be receptive and sensitive to changes in the historical profession, but also involved the old-fashioned empirical studies of questions of, in her case, of terrorism. And so we owe her a great deal of gratitude for the fact that, once again, the study of intelligence and political history is taken seriously by academia. I would argue it was always taken seriously outside of academia, but within the halls of academia, it lost a little of its luster. She is a powerhouse at Yale. She has just succeeded John Lewis Gaddis as the head of the Brady-Johnson program in Grand Strategy. And she is working on what I'm sure will be a very exciting book about J.Edgar Hoover, about which you are going to hear more today. After Bev, we have John Prados. If you don't know who John Prados is, leave, please. No, John, because those of you who care about the history of intelligence and the history of military strategy, who are looking for the kind of person who goes into the archives and finds something new absolutely every time and is so dogged about making sure things are declassified, that's John Prados. I have admired his work for a very long time, and I think I've played one of his board games too. John has just completed a book called The Ghosts of Langley, Into the CIA's Heart of Darkness. John, is that, I've lost count. What number book are we on now?
It's, I think, 31.
All right. There are many to choose from. I am a great fan of his book on covert action and of his incredibly detailed and very, very smart book. They're all smart, but this one's unbelievably tough and interesting. Tough in that it was hard to do, I'm sure. Book about the Japanese intelligence in World War II in the United States. It's brilliant. And Kai Bird. Kai Bird has been recognized by the most prestigious, I think, panel. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for his brilliant co-authored study of Robert Oppenheimer. Kai has contributed so much to our understanding of history. He's written biographies of people you might admire and people you might not admire. The point of Kai is that regardless of whether he admires them or not, he is fair, smart, honest, and does his homework. He's currently working on a biography of Jimmy Carter, about which you will hear nothing, but Kai will talk about something else today. So you couldn't have a better panel, and with that, all of you, you have a choice of either speaking from there or from the panel, from the desk. It's your choice. Bev, over to you. Thank you.
We, I think, are all hoping to have a discussion for some of the reasons that Tim outlined in that very generous introduction. And so today, I just want to offer a few thoughts about Venona itself in the context of the work that I've been doing on J.Edgar Hoover, who is going to be, we were discussing a little earlier, one of these presences who sort of looms over this whole conference. I'm in the sort of late, if not quite final stages of finishing a biography of Hoover, who was the director of the FBI from 1924 to 1972, and had his fingers in lots and lots of things over the course of that time. One of the challenges of this biography, as the last panel suggested, is that he had his hands in lots of incredibly complicated cases that remain incredibly controversial. So it's really useful for me to be in a room full of people who have done really deep dives into cases like the Hiss case, the Rosenberg case, and others, and to hear all of that, as well as more general thoughts. So as I said, I just wanted to offer a few thoughts about Venona. I think most people in this room know what Venona is, but Venona, the Venona project was a project, an intelligence project that ran really from the 1940s up until 1980, that involved the decryption of Soviet cables that had been intercepted during World War II. So between 1941 and 1945, those are the dates of the cables, and the intelligence establishment worked on this for many, many years with varying levels of attention and interest, most acutely in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They had mixed success, as we'll talk about a little bit, and that project remained secret until the 1990s, until after the end of the Cold War, and has produced quite a lot of scholarship once it became publicly known. So most of what's come out about Venona has been, we heard a little bit about this on the earlier panel, have been questions of what it is that those cables actually show us. A lot of the cables obviously had code names. A lot of the cables discussed espionage, some of which we've been able to figure out, some of which we haven't. I would like to talk a little bit about Venona, less for what it is that the content of that project can actually tell us than for what it might tell us if we want to read it slightly differently as a kind of archive of the FBI in particular, but the intelligence world in the late 1940s and early 1950s. I say this because the way that I approach it as a biographer is that I'm interested in what Venona can tell us, as I said, not about the particulars of every single case, but what it can tell us about how someone like J.Edgar Hoover experienced Venona, what he thought he knew at any given moment in that process, and how what he thought he knew might change how we understand the way he in particular behaved in big cases, in small cases, and how he was thinking about the world, how the knowledge that he thought that he had or didn't have was shaping what he thought the FBI and the rest of the federal government ought to be doing when it came to the question of Soviet espionage. So I will say in starting that there are a few things that remain pretty frustrating from that perspective about trying to make use of Venona. One is, as I said, the project itself remained highly incomplete. Most of the cables that were intercepted have not been translated, decrypted. We don't know a lot about most of the cables, so we have a very small percentage that is sort of legible to us. And of what is legible, there are still lots and lots of mysteries about what various names designate and how we want to think about that material. So there's that basic problem of what do we actually know there. For me, there are two other issues that are somewhat frustrating. So even when we know something, we don't necessarily know when the people who are working on the project knew what they knew. So we have materials that tell us a lot of the information, but it doesn't tell us whether someone like J.Edgar Hoover knew that in 1948, whether he knew it in 1951, or whether the FBI and the NSA figured it out in the 1970s. And so trying to then figure out what it tells us about how they're thinking about the world can be challenging. In some cases, we have more information than in others. And the last piece is that though we have the cables themselves, and we have largely through the work of the Moynihan Commission in the 1990s, we have some of the surrounding sort of internal bureaucratic correspondence about those documents. A lot of that we still don't have as well. So we don't have all of the details of what the FBI was really thinking about, again, in my particular case. So nonetheless, I think Venona is a pretty interesting archive from, again, not only a content, but a kind of bureaucratic intelligence, national security perspective. So I just want to highlight a few features that I think we can all consider and hopefully discuss. So one obvious question about Venona is the degree to which it drove prosecutions, and major prosecutions and investigations during the early Cold War. And there, I think we can say we have a pretty mixed bag. So in something like the Hiss case, I think it's quite clear that Venona didn't really matter much to the degree that we know when the FBI really started thinking about Venona and Hiss together. It's mostly after the Hiss prosecution. It was not the driving force that got them interested in Hiss. It was not what drove the trials in the late 1940s. Most of the Hiss case as a formal criminal prosecution was done before Venona really mattered, though there is a controversy, obviously, ongoing about what Venona might tell us about the Hiss case. By contrast with the Rosenberg case, it's clear that Venona played an incredibly important role and really was one of the things that first got the Rosenbergs identified as significant figures in the view of the FBI, and really then, in the end, played a major role in driving the prosecution and in giving intelligence officials a real confidence that they knew or thought they knew what they were talking about. So a third example that I'll just throw out is something like the Judith Copeland case, which was the case of a woman who was working in the Justice Department in kind of national security matters in the late 1940s, who was identified through Venona. She was prosecuted, but in part because the courts then demanded FBI evidence, FBI files, when she appealed. Then they actually backed away from continuing prosecution of Judith Copeland. Judith Copeland more or less eventually went free, in part because the FBI in particular wanted to protect Venona, wanted to protect its own files, and wanted to protect its own sources. So we have a very mixed picture. Sometimes Venona was totally irrelevant to these big cases. Sometimes it was one of the big driving forces. And then sometimes it was something that helped lead the Bureau to particular people, but then became a reason actually not to prosecute or not to go any further in order to protect the project itself, and in some cases to protect informants. So I think we have a very mixed bag in terms of its role in actually driving the major cases of the era. Before I finish up, though, I want to highlight a few places that I think Venona can reveal some important themes in this moment of such major expansion in the intelligence establishment, but particularly in this period of the late 40s and early 50s, which are our subject here today. One piece, and this goes back a little bit to what Ellen Schrecker was talking about at the end of the last panel, is that I think Venona indicates the degree to which we want to think about a lot of continuity between the war years and the post-war years. So we have a tendency to talk about the war as being one period, and then the early Cold War as being some sort of major break. But of course, all of these cables are from during the war itself. The project started during the war, though a lot of the information only began to come out after the war. And a lot of the sort of infrastructure that the FBI is dealing with after the war, and a lot of its early interest in communists and its access to the inner workings of the Communist Party, that was all really built during the war. And there's a really critical period that we tend to overlook from 1939 to 1941, the period of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, when the Communist Party is considered, on the wrong side of history because they're suddenly not anti-fascist anymore. And the FBI really begins its vast surveillance of the Communist Party in that period and then continues it through the war and into the later years of the war. So Venona, all of the information that's coming out from Venona was information from the war years, though it wasn't, as I said, necessarily known until after the war. And just to offer one other example, the Smith Act trial that Ellen Schrecker mentioned, a lot of the undercover informants who ultimately testified there had actually become informants for the FBI very early on in the war. So Herbert Philbrick is a good example. He actually became an undercover figure in the Communist Party in 1940, stayed there, and then testified at the Smith Act trial in 49. So as we think about this period, I think it's useful to think about a lot more continuity between what's going on in the war and the post-war years. I think for the FBI, it's also important to remember that a lot of what they learned from a project like Venona, and this becomes very important, the FBI really learns about Venona in 47, becomes more involved in 1948, and mainly what they find out in those early years is not a lot of detailed information, but they find out what they don't know, right? So that their experience is, on the one hand, you're beginning to get some names. On the other hand, what you have is this vast sea of cables that are apparently about Soviet espionage in the United States, and you don't know most of what they're talking about. So I think to the degree that there's a really increased sense of urgency, they have great confidence that there are spies out there and they have to figure out who they are. I think in terms of the FBI's mentality, we actually want to read Venona not only as a set of facts, but as a warning about how much else might be out there that you don't know about and that you better get on top of. Two other things to mention. I think that the FBI also experienced Venona not as what was described in the 1990s as one of the great triumphs of the Cold War. It was that in part from an intelligence perspective, but they also experienced it, as did the NSA and other figures working, other agencies working on it. They experienced it primarily, or at least in part, as an experience of defeat. One of the things they learned pretty quickly in the late 1940s, and certainly by 1950, was that though they had been investing all of this work in it, the Soviets knew pretty early on that these cables had been intercepted. They actually had people inside the intelligence project who were revealing and sending a lot of this back to the Soviets, so that in part what they were finding was that there were these levels of penetration. I mean, Kim Philby and Donald McLean are probably the most famous, the Cambridge spies, because the British had access to a lot of this information, but there were others as well. And so a lot of what the FBI learned was that that people had been tipped off, they had been warned, and that, in fact, a lot of their efforts had been for naught. The last thing that I think is interesting to think about in terms of Venona, and partly in terms of bringing it up to the present day, is that Venona can tell us quite a lot about secrecy and autonomy in the post-war intelligence establishment. So to me, one of the most remarkable things about the Venona project was that The NSA knew about it. The FBI knew about it. They shared certain information, and this is the late 40s and early 50s, when particular facts came up that were of importance. They shared them with the White House sometimes. They shared them with the State Department. They shared them with people who they thought ought to know, but they did not share the fact of what they were doing either with Harry Truman, the President of the United States, or with the CIA until about 1952. And so it is an example, I think, of the ways in which the FBI in particular understood itself to be the only reliable place in the federal government. It tells us a little bit about its institutional culture. They would have said that they were not sharing this fact because they did not trust anywhere else in the federal government not to leak this information. They felt that they were the only secure place for this information to be held. And J.Edgar Hoover in particular did not feel any obligation to explain what was going on to the President of the United States. So this has something to do with Hoover's relationship with Truman in particular, but I think it also tells us a good deal about the autonomy and the self-regard of the FBI and Hoover in particular in the late 1940s and early 1950s. So I will just offer a comment about the present. One of the things that has been very interesting to me about the present day, about the firing of James Comey and some of the controversy that has ensued since then, is the fact that we seem to be at a moment when people are clamoring for more autonomy for the FBI director to insulate him more from the kind of political pressures, from the president's ability to fire him. So it's just been a very funny moment to see many liberals and leftists having perhaps forgotten some of the lessons of the early Cold War, coming around, kind of championing the autonomous, independent, politically insulated intelligence establishment. So I will leave that there.
Thank you. Thank you, Bev. John?
Okay, I'm going to jump in right on top of that, just to start out and say, I'm wearing a button on my lapel here. It's for the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And just to talk about the FBI and its tactics and methods, all right? PVAW, by the way, is also 50 years old this year, and they are, in fact, celebrating their 50th anniversary today. And it's in that honor that I wear this button. But anyway, their New York chapter used to meet right over here in what used to be the Washington Square Presbyterian Church. Met once a month, and they carried out many actions and whatnot, so on and so forth. And they have had since they were active, and in fact they actually are still active, but they have had since they were active various functions, including anniversaries before this one. At the 25th anniversary of VVAW, which was celebrated downtown, there was a ceremony at Trinity Church, and a big hotel downtown was the center of the festivities. But at the ceremony at Trinity Church, someone laid out on the pews, and this was an early experience of classification and declassification, Tim, hundreds of pages of declassified FBI documents that revealed the day-to-day activities of the New York chapter of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And instantly, seeing that stuff, you thought back to, and the material was great. The material was like, who said what at the monthly meeting, and how much was raised at the fundraiser. You immediately thought, well, you were meeting with these people. Who was the source? Who was giving them this stuff? So the tactics that were used in the Smith trial and in the Rosenberg trial and in the other show trials that we've been talking about here, they didn't go away with the 1950s. They're still with us. And that goes to what Beverly was just saying about now we're wanting the FBI to have more autonomy. Question mark there. Anyway, to start with that, let me segue into something very different, which is our conversations at the conference here. Before, we had, maybe 10 years ago, a similar conference. And George Washington University had a conference like this about Rosenberg's and the atomic spying and the Hiss case in 2011. And here we are again in 2017 meeting on these issues again. Now, coming in here, I thought, oh, we're going to have those conversations like we did in these other occasions, and so I oriented myself that way. But here we are today, and the tenor of the conversation is very different. So in fact, when Beverly brings up the Venona situation, that's really the first big look at that we've had at this conference. You know, Kai was one of the big participants in the debate about which of the code names belonged to whom in the US government. And my thought was that we actually, I think, have paid a lot of attention, maybe too much attention, to those aspects of this debate. So I was going to go in a different direction. But before I do that, let me just say something about last night's conversation on the investigation of the Russian meddling into the US election. I thought that Steve Cohn's comments were over the top because they were kind of backwards. He's saying there's no evidence, so there should be no investigation. I submit to you that the integrity of the electoral process in the United States is of such a high importance, constitutional, national security, give it whatever adjective you like, that regardless of evidence, you know, it's necessary to investigate if there is a claim of an intervention with that process. More to the point, I don't think that what he interpreted as lack of evidence actually shows that. For example, he represented a certain document that was issued late last year by the Director of National Intelligence as a, quote, intelligence estimate, when in fact that document was simply a paper issued by this authority. Now, I criticized that paper on my website at the time in exactly the terms that he used last night. But that didn't make the paper a false national intelligence estimate. What that made was a paper that was a failure in a political debate. So I don't think that what the state of evidence is revealed in that conversation. All right? So let me segue now into what I was going to talk about, which was, or is, placing Venona and the debate over the Rosenbergs and Hiss in a broader historical context. We fought and won World War II, and World War II was an instant in time when our intelligence apparatus, if you want to call it that, sort of came of age. And I argued in the book Tim referred to, Combined Fleet Decoded, that World War II developed a set of pillars of the US intelligence system. Those being cryptography, traffic analysis, which is a part of that, aerial photography, overhead imagery, prisoner interrogation, document capture and translation, which are essentially espionage functions, technical intelligence, which is scientific in nature, liaison with allied intelligence services, and of course, and this wasn't so revealed in the Pacific theater, but counterintelligence, which is Venona, and special operations. Okay? So think about those for a second, and then think about Venona. Venona is a component of the counter-espionage pillar. So there's really a much larger environment, a much larger enterprise underway than the counterintelligence function of Venona. Now, let's just look at cryptography for a moment, okay? In the case of cryptography, Venona represented an attempt to penetrate Soviet cable traffic. The lesson of World War II, when we broke the German and Japanese codes, was that you act against codes of a broad array of other countries that you consider adversaries, competitors, and sometimes even friends. More to the point, the work that was done in World War II was still of value to the United States after the war, and not just in the area of Venona. For example, the German Enigma machine, which we broke, was still in use after World War II, carrying the diplomatic cable traffic of a number of countries, Sweden, Egypt, Middle Eastern countries, some Pacific Asian countries as well. All right? The Allied liaison that we were actively collaborating with was also giving us access to cryptography. The British from Hong Kong, from 1943 through 1947, were reading Russian cable traffic to the Chinese Communist Party in the Chinese Civil War, and they were sharing that material with the United States. So one thing is that Venona is just a subcategory of this material. Another thing is temporal in nature. That is, on a certain day, they remember it as Black Friday, was actually October the 29th, 1948. The Soviet Union changed its entire communications network. The one-time pads that had been used in Venona were replaced by a completely different operation. The channels, the systems, the style of communications, all different. That moment represented the moment that Venona sort of went out of existence. And when analysts and historians tell you that we focused on this, and indeed we did through the 1970s, the reason that those inquiries were backwards in terms of their time frame was because this was all that was available to the cryptographers to work on, all right? Meanwhile, there are these other pillars of intelligence, right? In terms of aerial photography, after the end of World War II, the United States was innovating new kinds of cameras, aircraft that were specialized to collect aerial photography, and units in the U.S. Armed Forces that were specialized just in operating in this framework. In the 1949-1950 period, right as this Venona thing is becoming active because you're required to look into the past, we are at the point where we are deploying dedicated overhead photography forces to the Far East and European theaters and starting to run peripheral flights around the Soviet Union. I might add, by the way, in terms of the general orientation of U.S. intelligence, that the purpose of it at that time was to collect information in support of a U.S. war plan against the Soviet Union. And by definition, the Venona cable traffic was never going to generate information about Soviet targets in the U.S. war plan. Only other kinds of intelligence collection could do that. traffic analysis type work could identify nodes in the Russian communications network that you could make into targets. Overhead photography could define targets so that you could set up target files for specific operations. Charles Peary Cabell, who was Alan Dulles' deputy director for Central Intelligence. Before that, he had been the Air Force's chief of target intelligence sort of management, and then chief of Air Force intelligence. In the ordinary routine meetings that the intelligence chiefs had about where they were going with their collection efforts, Cabell told NSA and CIA officials at one of these meetings that the collection they were doing in terms of traffic analysis and overhead photography was just the right stuff that he needed to document the plan that was then codenamed Drop Shot. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of these pillars of intelligence. I haven't got to talk about several of the others, but I'm out of time, so let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Kai?
I'm going to be very brief so that we have time for questions. We all love good spy stories. And I've written about a fair number of them myself through my biographies of McCloy and Bill Bundy and Mac Bundy. But in the end, I've learned that they really don't amount to very much. They don't matter. All this intelligence and the intelligence agencies are often just chasing their tails. We've heard a little bit of this. But to illustrate this rather dramatically, and I have to talk for one moment about Jimmy Carter.
It's okay, go ahead.
I just my last book was called The Good Spy, and it's a biography of a CIA officer who had created a highly secret back channel to the PLO for 10 years from 1969 to 1979. And of course, this covered part of the Carter years. So 2 days ago, I had an interview with President Carter in Atlanta, and I couldn't resist asking him about, well, you know, the Good Spy and this back channel, and you were briefed about it, of course, and here's evidence that Bob Ames was in the Oval Office on several occasions, and he confessed to me that he'd completely forgotten about this, had no knowledge of it. And I'd spent a whole book. It's a great story. It was important to the CIA. They kept this very close. But, you know, for the president, it was... And I'm afraid this is true of all spy stories. And it's true of Venona. I spent, you know, Victor Navasky here got me into a lot of trouble by persuading me to spend 6 months investigating the Ailes code name and the Venona papers, and it was a fun exercise. I came up with another name, possibly, who fit the identity of Ailes other than Alger Hiss. But as Beverly has pointed out, that, you know, most of what we know about Venona is that we don't know. And my great hope when I was writing that story about Wilderfoot and Alger Hiss was that it might stimulate other scholars to be able to really dig into the archives and release more stuff from the Russian archives. But we haven't had anything from the Russian archives. We really, you know, and most of these cases nothing new is going to be added from the American archives at this point. And the great disappointment about Venona is that it just ended there, and we have received nothing from the Russian archives. All of which reminds me that if you look back on, if you want to look at the Cold War and intelligence and the spy cases, you have to go back to George Kennan. Kennan understood from the beginning that it was all nonsense, that it was all, this relationship, this conflict we had with the Russians was overblown. He constantly told the policymakers, you know, tap it down, it's not so important. They didn't listen. They wanted to gin up war hysteria. They wanted larger budgets for intelligence and defense, and they got it, and Kennan was sort of pushed aside. But his view of the Cold War, that it was a silly conflict, overblown, over-militarized, and that it would end, hopefully, peacefully, was, I think, proven correct. And his other warning was that the real danger was with nuclear weapons. Now, you notice I'm mispronouncing nuclear. That's because I'm in my Jimmy Carter mode. And Kennan is right. We are still, that's the major lesson we've learned from the Cold War, that we are living with these weapons of mass destruction, and they're terrifying, and there still is a very serious threat of using these weapons again on the Korean Peninsula today. And so I think we need to put all of this in perspective. We love our spy stories. We need to pursue them, and it'd be terrific if the Russian archives would open up and we'd learn something more about all this, but all these wonderful spy stories. But they often don't get at the larger issues that are at stake. And on that, we should have some time for some questions now.
Well, thank you very much. I thought I would take the moderator's privilege to provide a few comments. First of all, thank you. Bev raised a very important point that I'd like to add to, which is that Venona could be viewed as a source of insecurity as well as security. And imagine, I run this thought experiment with students all the time. I say, should Venona had been made public in the 1950s, would this have made McCarthyism less likely or more likely? And if you run that experiment, and you run it with the number of decrypts, we don't know how many they had available, but let's say they didn't have 2,900, but maybe only 300. Can you imagine the congressional reaction if the FBI and it was before the NSA just started, the NSA provide you with these incomplete decrypts and say that this is part of a collection of, I don't know how many, 8,000, I don't know how many there were. Can you imagine the response and hysteria you'd have when people say, well, what are these code names that who are these people? And if you, and we know from what material we did get from the Russians, that the Russians use code names not simply for agents, but people, sometimes they talk to famous people. I mean, Franklin Roosevelt had a code name. Well, Franklin Roosevelt was not a Soviet agent. And Harry Hopkins was very, very, very likely not a Soviet agent, but he had a code name too. So if you just add up the number of code names, you could have hundreds of agents that weren't really agents. And so I've always felt that one of the reasons the FBI did not share this material with political figures was that actually it showed how weak they were and how little they knew. And in fact, how poorly they had done their jobs in World War II because there were so many penetrations. So there's a little bureaucratic politics here, not just power. It's actually weakness. And one other point, one of the things I would, when I think in terms of the role of intelligence services in the early Cold War, I periodize this. I think 1950 is an important break because of the Korean War. I think there's a lot of contestation in the period 45 to 50. I think some intelligence services are completely anti-Soviet right from the start, and others are not sure. And there's a debate within the White House, the Truman White House. That's why you end up with the Clifford Elsie, but it's really the Elsie Report of 1946. It's designed to get Truman to understand the Soviet threat. People in the White House did not think that Harry Truman was anti-Soviet in early 1946. He may have said a smart-ass thing to Molotov at one point, but that didn't make him anti-Soviet. And so you have this competition. And some, the FBI, I think you could easily put in the anti-Soviet part very early on, but not all of them. One thing that we've learned since Venona, it's little, but John hinted at it. We have some NSA histories that have come out, which indicate that US signals intelligence coverage of the Soviet Union was quite good. Not the Venona area, but on the military side until 1948. What we haven't done yet, unless you've done it although it would be early in your book, nobody has integrated that to figure out if threat perception about the Soviets was actually tamped down in 1947 and 46 because the United States had a really good sense of what the Soviet military was doing, which is why many people were not as afraid of the Soviets in that period, such as the President of the United States. Now in 48, it goes dark, and you can imagine that intelligence services, when things go dark, become even more alarmist. And so you might be able to see, as we do more work on this, when we rewrite the history of the early Cold War, which will happen, that there is a shift in threat perception at the highest levels because we don't have signals intelligence coverage after October of 48. I don't know. I hope to actually work on this at some point, but I haven't yet. But I do think so. When we are rethinking the early Cold War, we may find that our periodization is going to change a little bit. One last point, and I'm sure all of you have interesting questions to ask. About the Vietnam veterans against the war, I can't help but bring up, since you brought up Carter, I'm going to bring up Nixon. Okay. One of the most chilling, really one of the most chilling things I ever heard on the Nixon tapes, and there are a lot of chilling things and annoying and very frustrating and offensive things, but was a discussion in the summer of 1972 over a grand amnesty, a grand pardon, that Nixon wanted to pardon the burglars, but he knew he couldn't pardon the burglars by themselves because he understood exactly what that would imply. So he and Haldeman talked about a grand amnesty and to find some Vietnam dissenters that could be pardoned at the same time. And there had been something called the Gainesville trial. And this is a trial of Vietnam veterans against the war. And they said, you know what we could do? We could pardon those guys. Are there enough of them? Because we got all these burglars we got to pardon. So what about, and they said, you know what, we don't have enough of them. And then Haldeman said, but we could get more. On trumped up charges, we could pull in more of these Vietnam veterans against the war and get a certain number of people. Now think about, I mean, there's an element of cynicism in our society right now. Really? But stop for a minute and think about how chilling this is. You have the President of the United States and his Chief of Staff talking about subverting the justice system in order to permit a political pardon that will save the President's ass. And that would involve violating the civil rights of Americans who, by their First Amendment, are permitted to dissent. And these are also veterans who had already served their country loyally. If it's on tape, those are fully available. It's a reminder of a very sad period, which I hope we're not going to revisit. With that, do you have any questions?
Wait, can I just make a comment? I was at Gainesville. I was not a Vietnam veteran, but I joined Vietnam Veterans Against the War at a moment when they admitted people who were non-veterans. Anyway, there were 7 PVAW members who were on trial in Gainesville. By the way, there were 5 Watergate burglars. Right, so I'm not sure.
He wanted more. No, but he didn't want it 1 for 1. He wanted way more of the lefties.
Okay.
Because then they'll be so happy they won't notice the fact that all these Cuban Americans have been let out of jail.
Right, and anyway, like Dr. Schrecker was saying earlier about communist trials, you know, a bunch of other VVAW people went down to Gainesville to march in support of the people who were on trial, right? So there was this public display element that was going on in conjunction with that trial. But actually, talk about trumped-up charges, the government's case disintegrated against Vietnam veterans against the war, because then it turned out that, in fact, the FBI was bugging the defense conference room so that the discussions among the lawyers and the defendants every day was going to right to the prosecutors. And in the afternoon one day, when the janitor was sweeping the hallway, the closet door fell open, and inside the closet was revealed all the electronics of the taping devices that were installed into the bugs of the defense conference room. And at that point, the trial just fell apart.
Yes, and yes, please use the mic. Thank you.
I have a comment about it doesn't amount to it. The spy stories don't amount to a hill of beans. So another spy story that belongs in this conference is the Rudolf Abel story, which I wrote about. And when I would say that whether the spy story affected anything is not the point. The point is the propaganda use made by the government of those spy stories. Because when Abel was put on trial in 1957, it was a show trial to prove that the McCarthyism was true, that there was a Russian spy behind every door, and you know, all the rest of it. And so in that sense, they really did matter, not in the sense you described. Don't you think?
Well, but I think that proves my point, is that they, you know, if they matter at all, they're fodder for this domestic political battles here at home, and that matters. Yes, but they don't. It doesn't matter in terms of the actual intelligence that was conveyed, the intelligence that was stolen. All of that rarely matters.
Right. If I can add one thing on that point too, so it's not just the public drama where they tend to matter, but one in thinking about Hoover and Truman and this moment in the late 1940s, and this goes a little bit to what you were saying, Tim. You know, Hoover in 1944 and 45, so well before Venona, is going to the Truman White House, and they produce a report, it's about 600 pages or something, saying, uh-oh, we think there's this Soviet espionage network in the US government. And 45, Truman's not super interested. Truman doesn't want to do right. The FBI at that point, Hoover certainly himself, thinks of himself as as an executive agency, right? He wants the White House to act. He wants this to be taken care of behind the scenes. And Truman's sort of like, you know, I don't like the FBI. I don't think this is a big deal. And in the end, that becomes one of the reasons that the FBI, which did not like the House Un-American Activities Committee in the early part of the 40s, but it becomes one of the reasons that the FBI then, in 1947, begins its more overt, although also covert, work with the House Un-American Activities Committee, because they didn't think Truman was taking these issues seriously enough. So you've got a public drama where it matters, and then you have this whole bureaucratic and institutional drama that's also going on where it matters, even if the espionage itself is really neither here nor there often.
Let me add something in support of Kai. And fast forward to the 1980s a little bit, where the year 1985 is often spoken of as the year of the spy. All right? This is the year actually that Aldrich Ames begins leaking to the Russians, and just before the FBI spy Hansen starts leaking to the Russians, but it comes on the tail end of a period during which the CIA had had remarkable success in recruiting Russians to spy for us. The Popov case, the case of the guy that was important to the Carter guys in the first months of the administration, all of those originated during this time frame just before 1985 and involved first the Americans wiping out Russian spy networks in the US consisting of Americans who were spying for Russia, and then upon Ames and Pelton and the other spies of that time for the Russians wiping out Russians who were spying for America, right? So when Kai talks about intelligence agencies chasing their own tail, there's an important element of truth to that.
I'd like to add, though, that in intelligence agencies, and that even Kennan was a great fan of covert action in the beginning, and that was done through intelligence agencies. And so I would differentiate between human intelligence, the issue of the spy, the individual spy, and the secret operation to influence public opinion and to pay off and support certain candidates in other countries and to build up newspapers and assist paramilitary operations. And I think that's an element, too, of the intelligence community that grows up in the Cold War period. And that did matter, and it depended on the president. Not every president thought it mattered, but many of them did. So for them, I think they'd be aware of those. They wouldn't know the details, they wouldn't know the name of the agents, but they'd know that they were doing something in a certain country overseas.
I also think there were two Kennans. There was an early Kennan and a later Kennan.
Yes.
And separating those two Kennans, there's a moment where the Russians ran an op against him when he was in Germany as ambassador in the early 1950s.
I think that the pivot is 50 because he's very upset at the Truman Doctrine. I think he sees the militarization of the Cold War as the unwanted child of the work he had done in 46. And I think that's when he has that debate with Lippmann. I believe it's with Lippmann. Where's it? No, it's a debate, I think, with Lippmann, because he's being blamed for the militarization of the Cold War. I think it's 50 that you get the later Kennan. And the later Kennan is the one who writes all the books, not the early Kennan. So, more questions. Go ahead, Ellen.
I just have two questions, one for Bev and one for John. John, one thing I ran across in my current research is the way in which the Russian Research Center at Harvard was being used. They had done a survey of Soviet society. Do you know about this? And some branch of the intelligence agency was using it for finding targets. Do you know about this at all?
Give us both questions.
Okay. And then the other question for Bev is about the fact that the FBI was guarding Venona and couldn't use it in trials, meant that then it had to find other kinds of evidence, which they may have faked, right?
So I think that's one of the key pieces of Venona, if I'll just jump in on that. And then is how, as Ellen says, as how it then led. So the FBI often thought that it had this information, right, this rock solid, absolute proof of something. They could not reveal that in court, and so therefore, I mean, the FBI, I should say, often preferred to do things, as Ellen has written about and many other people, entirely outside of the courtroom, right? That was actually not Hoover's favorite venue. Gave too much control to the Justice Department about whether they're going to prosecute and how. It was public. It opened the FBI to scrutiny. So where things could be taken care of behind the scenes with a blind memo through a congressional committee, through employers, by getting people fired from the government, that was the preferred method often. But sometimes you had to produce actual evidence. So what do you do when you think you have this really hardcore evidence that you cannot share with anyone? So one piece that I think is really important is that this helps to explain, at least in some cases, why the FBI relied so heavily on informants and on informers who seemed to the public to be, not reliable narrators. Probably the most obvious example is someone like Elizabeth Bentley, who was one of the FBI's, greatest sources of information, who was a pretty erratic person, who was widely attacked. So why did the FBI have so much confidence in Elizabeth Bentley? That's partly because they knew about Venona and thought that a lot of what she was saying seemed to be matching up at certain points. And then, so something like this wouldn't have mattered as much. much to the Smith Act trial, but then they also made a set of calculations about whether, though they always wanted to protect their informants who were still inside the party, whether it was better to sacrifice those people and make them public in order to protect Venona. So actual faked evidence, I don't, it seems within the realm of plausibility. I mean, nothing is coming to mind. We could have a typewriter conversation again. So maybe there is some new evidence about that there. So actual faked evidence, I think, is a little bit harder to come by, but I'm certainly open to other people telling me about that. But they certainly went in terms of, they would put forth evidence that seemed baffling to most people. It's at least some of why we end up with the debate that we do around McCarthyism, where the intelligence agencies are saying, we're absolutely sure. People are saying, how can you be so sure? And they are saying, just trust us. We know, right? Which is not a very reassuring thing. So.
Just to throw in Gainesville and PVAW one more time, one of the defendants in that trial spoke afterwards about how the lead government witness against them, his best friend, suddenly turned into an FBI source, informant, and was lying on the witness stand. So that's an example of exactly the kind that you're referring to. But your larger question, let me take that on. When I was in grade school, the way that we learned state capitals was that the teacher gave us a blank sheet of paper with an outline of the United States states on it, and you had to fill in the name of the capital of each state, right? So that's how you learned the state capitals, In 1945, to a large degree, the Soviet Union was exactly that representation. It was a blank sheet of paper with a few geographical outlines on it and a big empty interior. U.S. intelligence perceived the need to fill in the blanks on that map, and that was the beginning of the Soviet intelligence effort. And to fill in the blanks, they mobilized every kind of resource that they could get their hands on. Now, in part of this early period, the sort of analytical side of the CIA led the intelligence espionage side of the CIA in terms of what they were doing and how they were innovating ways to get information. And one of their first ideas, actually, was to reach out to academia. So in fact, the first head of a defined intelligence directorate at the CIA was a Harvard historian who had done similar work for the OSS during World War II. An early chief of scientific intelligence at the OSS was, at the CIA, was Harvard/MIT academic by the name of Max Millikan. And when it came time to look at, let's call it the Cambridge Collective, for what they could leverage out of them, Millikan took the lead because he knew all the people in the Harvard complex and the MIT complex and so forth. So he suggested to CIA people that they could, in fact, work with these academics to fill in this outline map of Russia. And the CIA then funded an entity that was called the Center for International Studies that started at MIT, and Millikan was its first director, and it had other directors, and they enlisted people from Harvard as consultants, and they made investments in other places too. The Russian Institute at Columbia had some funding from CIA, and there are questions about whether academics in both Harvard and other places had ties running into the CIA. So there was definitely an element of this. Unfortunately, I don't think we have enough evidence to answer your question specifically, right? beyond Milliken and those early ties, some of which resulted, by the way, in significant personnel people coming into the agency, we don't have concrete evidence.
Yes.
I wanted to say a few words about Venona and the Rosenberg case, and then to ask a question. I would say the Rosenberg case was really the single important achievement, if you can put it that way, of Venona. It really gave the FBI the confidence to go ahead with the prosecution, and based a lot of its, the content of the trial was based, as we've later learned, on Venona. It's interesting, I mean, you've talked about how they couldn't use Venona, but they did use Venona at the trial. They did not share it with the defense, of course, although they probably shared it with the prosecution. Certainly the FBI agents who were involved in the investigation knew about it. Manufacturing evidence did happen in the Rosenberg trial, and it happened because the prosecution was aware that this was a done deal. They knew they knew that Julius was guilty. If the defense had had Venona, I think they might have had a shot at protecting Ethel, because Venona, as you said, everybody had a code name, but Ethel did not. And it clearly said Ethel did not work. And the person who was one of the main decryptors, Meredith Gardner, has said that did not work means did not work in our espionage project. So Venona had a lot of problems. The reasons why, and I'm curious why you think they could not use it in the trial.
Right, so when I say, I guess two things to clarify. So when I say that they couldn't use it, they used the information from Venona, certainly to identify people, to go after them. When I say they didn't use it, I just mean they didn't say, we have been decoding Soviet cables and here. So, as I said in talking, it certainly drove a lot of the Rosenberg prosecution. And in terms of, the question of faked evidence, I guess what I had in mind was sort of the explicit manufacture of physical evidence, which is what I took your question to be. I mean, the FBI certainly, and the Justice Department as well, guided witnesses and informers based on what they knew. I mean, they got people to say certain things that those people may or may not have known. In some cases, they certainly guided witnesses in that sense. And they also engaged in pretty widespread, both in the 40s and 50s and then later on, they engaged in widespread sort of I guess I would say COINTELPRO, right? So counterintelligence, in the sense that they were doing a lot of things behind the scenes, really outside of either the gathering of intelligence or prosecution, to sort of manipulate the situation, right? To everything from having informants plan rumors within organizations, et cetera, and more serious things than that. So that was also all going on during much of the period that we're talking about. So,
I'd add two things. One, that it's only later that they're certain that the Soviets know about Venona,
right,
because of and it has to do with the fact that Burgess and McLean go to Russia, and then there's concern that Philby, who knew about Venona. He was the head of British intelligence in Washington at that point, and had been briefed on Homer, which was turned out to be McLean's code name. The other thing I'd mention to you, since we're in a law school, is I just ask you to run the thought experiment. If you were the defense attorney and the government turned over two not fully decrypted intercepts, and you began to say, well, where are the others? What's missing? Why have these been provided? Let us see the entire collection that you have. How do we know the translations are correct? Could we see the originals? The material would fall apart. A good defense attorney would say, how do we know that this wasn't fabricated? Show us everything. And why is it that you could only decrypt this amount. So and I'm not a lawyer, and I don't play one on TV, but I think we are in a law school. Just think about the process of discovery and what a defense attorney, well, it's hearsay because it's how do you know that the Russian intelligence officer wasn't lying, or at least actually exaggerating, which is, so I can see just perfectly good legal reasons why you wouldn't do it besides the security reasons. Yes, sir, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, I'll broaden it to the European context. There was a period where we were worried France might go communist, Italy certainly might go communist. England's got a socialist government from 45 to 50. I mean, the left is on the move. Maybe that gave confidence to the Communist Party in America. Hey, they're going left there, we'll go left here. It doesn't work that way. The interesting thing why leads to today, it seems to me today we're not interested in Europe. We could care less. Let Europe do what they want to do. The question is, it seems because the focus here is on U.S., Russia, U.S., Russia. What about this idea about Europe? We know Kennan with his containment, we know Truman Doctrine, we know Marshall Plan, but I still get the feeling that it was back burner. We really weren't that concerned about how France is going to govern itself, how Italy's going to govern itself, which way England's going to go, Greece. It wasn't really something that we focused on. Am I right, or am I wrong on that?
I spent a good deal of this spring in Independence, Missouri, going through Truman's Psychological Strategy Board records on this period from 1951 through 1953. And to judge from the records of this entity in the Truman administration was considered to be the Cold War headquarters for the United States. It was conceived that way, and it was supposed to lead and establish strategy for U.S. covert programs across the globe. In any case, the degree of concern that those records exhibit for the situations in Europe, France and Italy specifically, but other countries as well, Germany certainly to a great degree, says to me that they were highly concerned about this, and that they were willing to go to great length to ensure that these European countries stayed within the Western fold. For example, in both France and Italy, the plans, the strategies that the Psychological Strategy Board came up with for U.S. activities in those countries involved actively besmirching and destroying the reputations of Socialist Party and Communist Party representatives in the national assemblies of those countries. Measures that were actually so far beyond the pale that the U.S. State Department itself demanded in Washington, in Truman's councils, demanded that implementation of any of these plans should be subject to a board within the embassy itself that should have the ability to override and countermand any of these kind of reputation, these kind of extreme measures, let's put it that way, extreme measures.
Hi, I've gotten a little confused about how people are talking about the Rosenberg case and what the FBI knew through the Venona project. It's been my impression that what the Venona project revealed was how little Julius Rosenberg did to get the so-called secret of the atom bomb to the Russians, not the evidence. Somehow you're giving the impression that the FBI had real information about how Julius Rosenberg got the secret of the A-bomb to the Russians, when actually it shows how little he knew, and that they knew all along that Ethel knew nothing. But the other question is, I can't remember the guy's name. I thought, it was my impression now, this was like 10 years ago, that the Venona project revealed the real U.S. citizen who got really important information.
Ted Hall.
What was his name?
Ted Hall.
A Harvard physicist,
Right.
a young Harvard physicist who spent the rest of his days in Cambridge as a professor, Cambridge, England. So that's the real story, that the FBI went along knowing about who the real person was all along, making
And Hall
up,
was not
exaggerating
No,
the Rosenberg under executing.
Let me see if I can
yeah.
provide you with some helpful context. I'll tell
Yeah.
you this. The issue is couriers.
The issue is what?
It's a matter of couriers. The weakness of an intelligence operation is in whenever a spy seeks to send information to the spy master, or receive information, or receive money. That's the weakness in the envelope of security around a human intelligence agent. It was, if you will, arguably better luck or good luck, Julius Rosenberg's courier, okay, gets turned. Gold.
turned is not a code
What I
term.
mean is he confesses.
These are
And
terms
because
of
he's
art.
and the reason he confesses is that he is also the courier for Fuchs, Klaus Fuchs. So Klaus
Who
Fuchs.
was a real
Yes, I know, but,
Yes.
important,
But,
yeah.
no. But that I want to explain what happened as best I understand it. We can all reconstruct it. I mean, any of us could have said this, but I'm happy to do it. So you have these two intelligence operations, the Fuchs case and the Rosenberg case, and they share a courier named Gold, Harry Gold. Harry Gold provided the kind of information on the Rosenbergs that you could use in court.
But for what? For
No,
stealing the secret of the A-bomb?
No,
yeah.
that, and I think historians have moved on and have said that the evidence about the A-bomb doesn't match it, but
The guy was executed, and so was his wife.
well, but
yeah.
Julius Rosenberg was a spy for an adversarial power, and that was something that a lot of people wouldn't admit at the time, and we know that now. What he stole, and if you the element of treachery or treason, if you think it depends on whether it was an A-bomb or not, making the argument there was the A-bomb, we found as historians that doesn't work, because that evidence isn't there. The fact that he was a spy for the Soviet Union, we know. Why didn't Ted Hall, who did steal information, that did help the Soviets, why doesn't he go to jail? Because his courier was his friend Sable Sachs. And Sable Sachs and he were both interrogated or interviewed by the FBI, and they were brilliant liars. And they lied in the late 40s, and the FBI at that time, it is my understanding, did not have the kind of Venona information on them that they could have said to them, they had a little bit, but not enough. And the fact is they couldn't be prosecuted. And it's a great story, and you're right, they should have been,
No,
but there was
it's what it sheds on the Rosenbergs.
no,
that's
I
such a
don't think
great
it's,
story.
well, I
Here, let me
humbly-
jump in on that. Let me give you two terms of art, okay? And one is Rosenberg was what they call an access agent, all right? He was a person who enabled the NKVD at this time to get access to people who might be potential spies. So in a sense, he was the ringmaster of a network, okay? And you're right, the Venona records that I have seen show Rosenberg in this milieu of giving them access to other people, not in the milieu of the other kind of spy. The term of art is a penetration agent, right? Ted Gold is a penetration agent. David Greenglass is a penetration agent. Fuchs, those people who actually get the information. So the records that I've seen don't show Rosenberg getting the information, but they do show Rosenberg connecting the Russians with people that can be potential penetration agents.
Just one last question, did the FBI know about Hall all along?
I mean, all along, we know that they knew about him in the
While
late
they were
40s.
prosecuting the Rosenbergs?
By then, yes.
But yeah, they knew, but they didn't have the evidence.
But they knew,
But that
right?
doesn't, the thing is, the FBI, I think, and Bev knows better than any of us, realized there were lots of people that they knew something about, but they couldn't prosecute all of them. They didn't have Fortunately, in our system, you need a certain level of information to prosecute someone. Couldn't get them indicted. Thank you. Yes.
Hey guys, I think this is in Bev's bailiwick, but I'd be happy to hear from any of you on it. Given kind of the proprietary issues around Venona and other kind of intelligence, what was the relationship between Hoover and contacts in, say, McCarthy's camp like, as far as sharing information is concerned?
Mm-hmm. So Hoover and Joe McCarthy are an interesting pair. They were actually, so they were friendly. They shared a certain amount of information at certain points, but they were temperamentally pretty different. And Hoover didn't like actually a lot of what McCarthy did. So Hoover thought McCarthy was a little bit of a loose cannon, that McCarthy, when he went public with information about numbers of spies, he didn't know what he was talking about. He felt like McCarthy actually damaged the FBI in certain ways. That said, they did sometimes share information. So I don't know, there are sort of particular people who became points of contact. I mean, what the FBI tended to do with someone like McCarthy, and pretty selectively, was to, when they thought it was in their interest to provide information, they would make what was called a blind memorandum. So they would write up the information that they had, make it untraceable to the FBI, and then use any number of people. So one of the things that you see on HUAC, on McCarthy's staff, on the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee, a lot of congressional committees and congressmen themselves, the Appropriations Committee, congressional committees that were important to the FBI were often staffed by current or former FBI agents. And so they were often a pretty useful conduit. So there were a lot of former FBI agents around McCarthy. The Appropriations Committee, it was an incredibly smart move when they needed professional staff, that the FBI decided the Appropriations Committee will provide you with your professional staff. Sometimes those agents were very close with Hoover, ex-agents. Sometimes there were rifts between them. But so that's kind of there were certain people who were I'd say couriers or conduits of that kind of information, but it could vary quite a lot.
Kai, you should tell the story about Bill Bundy's Q clearance.
His Q clearance. What about it?
All right, I'll tell it then.
He had Q clearance. So.
When it came time for Bill Bundy to renew his Q clearance, which is the clearance that gives you access to nuclear weapons information, of course, you have to fill out all those forms that Trump's son-in-law and all those guys have been not filling out for the last year or so to get the clearance renewed. And the clearance forms go to the FBI, which is the responsible authority for vetting security clearances for American government officials. So Bill Bundy was working for the CIA at this time. He fills out the form for his security clearance, which shows that he made a contribution to the Alger Hiss Legal Defense Fund, right? So this form goes to the FBI, and I am informed that McCarthy went after communists at the CIA within 48 hours of that form's arrival at FBI headquarters.
Right, no, it's a great story, but of course, the CIA did the right thing. Alan Dulles said, we're not going to let Bill Bundy testify, and Bill went on vacation for a long weekend. Disappeared. They couldn't find him. So, you know, the CIA knew enough to protect their own.
Sir.
Yeah, Mr. Naftali, I wonder whether the sentence you spoke just a bit ago, Julius Rosenberg was a spy for an adversarial power, should be at least qualified. I mean, probably, given that the trial was going on in 1951, who would argue with that? But given when the activity occurred, couldn't they just as easily be described as a wartime ally?
You have to think in terms of the objective that Mr. Rosenberg had. He knew he was doing it. Why was he doing it secretly? Why had he chosen to do it with conspiratia? Why didn't he just share it? Well, I think, at least from the Soviet records, and from his Soviet case officer, Feklisov, whom I met, Julius understood that he was a spy. He knew he was a spy. Now, Ethel is a different story. We could discuss that. She certainly knew that he was a spy, but the fact is he understood he was a spy, and the very fact that he understood that meant he knew that it wasn't right.
But there's a context. They were losing many millions of people at the time so that Hitler could be defeated on his Eastern Front.
Well, there are other ways to
something.
There are other ways to help the Soviet war effort. There were ways to raise money. There were all kinds of public events that, in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt went to. There were ways of doing it without engaging in espionage.
This is a question more to do with today, but I'm just wildly curious if there's any proof or investigation about the Brexit vote and the Russians. Did they influence it? Huh?
That would be pure speculation, but from what we know about Russian active measures in the recent past, and from just reasoning from Russian national interest in terms of breaking up a European community, you might answer that question in the affirmative. But on the other hand, if you look at British great power interests and at the discomfort that the United Kingdom has exhibited toward a unified Europe for decades since the common market in the 1960s, you wouldn't need much of a Russian push to make a Brexit vote happen.
Thank you.
We have time for one more
I
question.
have a question about that, sort of the accumulation of criticism of Hoover and his methods, his protection of his information, his sources. What's kind of the history of that? I know that, like, Robert Jackson, when he was Attorney General, hated Hoover and distrusted him and created the Foreign Agents Unit in the Justice Department to avoid Hoover, right? But so when is there a kind of accumulation of public criticism? Who are his public defenders? Who are his public critics?
Right.
Thank you.
Well, I'll give a very quick answer to that, which is, so for his whole career, so Hoover really became a public figure in a significant way in the 1930s around crime issues, and though he was involved in the Palmer raids as a very young man, and in German internment during the First World War, that was actually his first job in the US government. When he entered straight out of law school, it happened to be the start of World War I, and he was put on German internment. So I think it is worth noting that though we think of Hoover as the mastermind of all of these things, as a very young man, he really was taught in the very early years of the security state to make these kinds of judgments about who was safe, who was dangerous, how you classify them, what you do with them in the United States. So that's an aside. So he really became a national figure in the 1930s around crime issues, John Dillinger and such, and then in the 1940s became much more publicly associated with the question of communism and intelligence and security. So he had critics his whole career, both within the government and outside of it. So some of those were bureaucratic battles, some of them were ideological battles. But as a public figure, and this is one of the things that's most interesting to me as his biographer, as a public figure, he was, again, not within the left, really, ever, but he was one of the most popular, most well-respected figures in the federal government until the 1960s. And it's really in the 1960s that persona begins to collapse and come under sustained attack in serious ways. It's worth remembering that Franklin Roosevelt was really the person who gave Hoover most of his power. In many ways, Hoover was kind of birthed out of the growth of the liberal government during that period, and he had a lot of friends and enemies on both sides. But his really intense period of public criticism comes in the 60s, and then right after his death.
Would you say that starts with Sanford Unger?
Yeah, I mean, so I think it really comes to fruition sort of around different figures in the 60s. But Hoover happens to also die in 1972, which is at a moment when the church committee gets going a few years later, et cetera. So I mean, it's not that he's not around to defend himself, and some of that was already happening during his lifetime. But there are various both left writers, civil liberties organizations, Victor Navasky, other figures from that period who I think really create the sustained image that we have of Hoover as the man that we know him to be today.
And Fred Cook.
Fred
of the
Cook
Nation.
is another one.
Cook,
Yes,
yes.
exactly.
Well, we've been really, as I promised, we've been treated to a great discussion. I want to thank Bev and Kai and John and all of you for your attention. Thank you very much.